So chapter 18 has been dealing with progressivism, and so part 2, we're going to be looking at progressivism in politics. So the roots of progressivism come from Europe. There's a book called Atlantic Crossings by Daniel Rogers that talks about a lot of the progressive thought that comes from Europe into the shores of the United States. And Germany is really kind of the primary example, because what Otto von Bismarck, as Chancellor of Germany, does is he begins to introduce pieces of social legislation into the government in order to diffuse the more radical political parties that are rising within the government. So rather than have to have an election where these parties may potentially gain the upper hand, Bismarck is taking a page from their playbook in order to diffuse the problem and hopefully help the government stay in power without having to do too much in the way of change their society to benefit these more radical elements. So the health insurance bill provides health insurance for workers. Accidental insurance is introduced as a way to help workers who were injured or who were disabled because of an injury. And in all of these cases, the employer is paying a portion and the government is paying a portion. And so this is really the model of let's say, a workers' compensation in the United States. We're borrowing this directly from Germany. Old age and disability insurance, workers' protection in 1891, and then child labor laws are passed in 1903. So all of these are coming about mostly from responding to the political situation within the government. So when we look at the chart, who influences the progressives? You've got the social gospel movement, Christian social reform, society must take responsibility for the less fortunate. Sounds very familiar, or it should hopefully sound very familiar to what we've seen with Carnegie and others. The populists, improving conditions for farmers and workers, curb the power of big business, make government more acceptable. These come into and kind of help define who the progressives are. They want to improve society. They want to use political action. They're going to use the government to solve their problems. And this is when we start viewing government as a solution as opposed to a problem. And then, of course, you have the regulation of big business. So what is the difference between populism and progressivism? The biggest difference, I think, is who you're looking at or who this embodies. The populists are farmers and workers. These are lower class individuals. Progressives are mostly middle class. Populism is also looking at government ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephone lines, graduated income tax, direct election of U.S. senators, the use of the initiative, referendum, and recall. All of these things we find on the populist column. Progressives believe that laissez-faire is obsolete, but they still do support capitalism. We're not advocating the overthrow of an economic system. And that's what's really important to remember. Even though you have a socialist slant to progressives, for the most part, what they're doing is they're trying to fix the ill or the problem in society rather than overthrow the system. They're applying principles of science and efficiency. They're viewing government as a key player in creating a more orderly, stable, and improved society. And they believe that government has the power to combat special interests and to work for the good of the community, state, or nation. Progressives on the whole do not feel that political parties are going to help. They see the political parties as part of the problem, which is an interesting idea. One of the main thing, though, another thing, I'm sorry, to think about populist versus progressivism. They both advocate that there should be more power to the people. Um, and that's an interesting aspect because there are some things about the progressives that aren't seen as democratic, even though they're trying to make it more um, democratic, if that makes sense. Um, they pull in the description down here at the bottom is very accurate, putting more power in the hands of non-elective, non-partisan professional officials. So populism is focused on more of a democratic, get the power into the people's hands. Progressives are saying you need to get the corruption out of the system. Um, in some cases, they're advocating things that are more democratic, but in some cases, they aren't. And that's an important thing to remember. Hope that makes sense. So John Dewey's effective freedom has two preconditions: the necessary material means to fulfill one's desires, and mental capabilities allowing one to use foresight and make proper decisions. One of the basically what he's saying is you have to be financially comfortable and you also have to have some sort of education. This is a very unique progressive argument. Progressives firmly believe in science. They firmly believe in knowledge as a source of solution for the problems that America is facing. Um, the populists, however, don't have this aspect. The populists are just saying the American people need to have the power. The power needs to return to the people. Progressives are arguing that you need to have educated and well-intentioned people in those roles to lead society to where it needs to go. And that's essentially what John Dewey is arguing. So, progressive democracy, we've talked about this, giving a voice to the marginalized. This is very similar to populism, but there are some differences. So recall, initiative, and referendum, these are ways in which the American people get to have their voices heard. Recall means that you have an elected official who is recalled from their position. So you could have them removed. In other words, you could fire a politician. An initiative is a ballot initiative put on the ballot. So let's say you want to buy a particular piece of land for a public park. You would have that initiative put onto the ballot. You have to have a certain number of votes or a certain number of people sign your petition for it to appear on the ballot. The referendum is a way of, do we want this land to be turned into a park? Yes or no? The referendum allows people to vote on it without it being firm. The initiative is what is a firm decision. So if you're talking about the public park example, the referendum says, okay, let's do this. The initiative says, we are doing this and it will happen. The secret ballot, also called the Australian ballot, is another progressive element. Direct election of U.S. senators, appointed positions for some officers rather than all being elected. This here is an example of where progressivism and populism divides. Populism would never allow for appointed positions because that's too much like patronage. It's too much of leaves too much corruption that could take place. Literacy tests for immigrants. Again, we want people who are coming to the United States who understand their role within American government, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. These are things that are fundamental to the American system. If they don't understand it, then they don't belong here. That is, again, a progressive idea, not populist. Residency requirements for voters and for office holders. So if you just move to the area and you want to run for office, you can't. until you've been there maybe 2 years, whatever the requirement is. Or if you're just moved to the area and you want to vote, and they may have a 1 year requirement for you to be in residency before you can vote in those elections. Again, very progressive, not a populist thing, but a very progressive thing. So this just kind of breaks down some of the progressive reforms, direct primaries, the 17th Amendment, that U.S. senators are elected by popular vote, initiatives, referendums, and recall. Power, really the effective thing is that the power moves to the voters for these particular elements, not across the board, but just for these particular elements. So progressivism, one of the ways in which they want to combat the issues of government is by supporting women's suffrage and feminism. So what women are looking for, and this is the first wave of feminism, there are several different waves that we'll be talking about throughout the course. First wave is, Women's Christian Temperance Union, these organizations that are coming out of the abolition movement, where they're calling for legal representation of women, economic opportunities for women, and the vote. You have a number of very famous women players in this, but the end result is they want the legal representation, the economic opportunities. And in many cases, this is satisfied during the Gilded Age. However, what you're starting to see is the rise of the second wave of feminism, which would be women's suffrage. During this period, we have kind of a new feminism that develops, and this is the kind of the transition period from the new woman of the Gilded Age to the flapper of the 1920s. Isadora Duncan is a great example. She is a dancer. She's a self-taught dancer. She has children out of wedlock. She is seen with many different men and travels around the world. She becomes a very prominent figure for women. Another figure is Margaret Sanger, who launches the birth control movement. And Margaret is very much like a muckraker. She works within the cities, within the urban areas, and she sees all of these immigrant women who have, 6 or 7 different children, not practicing birth control. The families are barely making ends meet, barely being able to eat. And so she launches this movement in order to help women understand what birth control is, and that they don't have to just keep having children. And a natural result that comes out of this is that she's trying to empower women as well, so that the woman has control over her body. And this, of course, her organization that she creates eventually becomes Planned Parenthood. But it's very much about education and giving women power over their own body. Emma Goldman, who is pictured in the middle, is a socialist activist who is also working for women's rights as well as worker rights. And she ends up she's a very volatile figure, but she ends up, as we'll see, being deported for her activism. But these are 3 very different women that we don't see during the Gilded Age per se, but they're beginning to kind of demonstrate the loosening of the mores around women, that women are actually able to do more, and this kind of idea of the empowerment of women during this period. So women's suffrage begins to move on the state level. The first election in which women are voting is 1920. So Wyoming in 1869, the Utah Territory in 1870, and Washington Territory in 1883 allowed women to vote. So how do we move from this period of the 1860s when women are in the West are just beginning to vote to 1920 when women are allowed to vote? There are two main strategies to get women's suffrage passed. Essentially, they're trying to work through the state legislatures. They're trying to get suffrage passed state by state, and then they're also trying to pass a constitutional amendment. They know that in order to get the constitutional amendment passed, they have to have at least 3/4 of the states, 36 states, approve it. So what they're doing is actually pretty smart. By working on the state level, they are going ahead and getting state legislatures to pass women's suffrage so that when it comes up for the constitutional amendment, of course they're going to support it because they already have it within their state. So they're getting the major hurdle, which is the state legislature, out of the way first. Many states are beginning to pass maternalist reforms. Maternalist reforms are essentially pensions for helping poor single women who have children. And of course, the way they're doing this is they're giving them basically welfare or pensions. And these are getting passed within the state legislatures. What this does, however, it begins to cast women as dependents of the state government. So women who do not have a husband and have children are kind of, the way the state is looking at it is it's their obligation or the legislature's obligation to watch out for these women because they don't have men to protect them. That's not exactly what the women's suffrage movement wants the legislatures to feel, because that's encouraging the same philosophy that they're fighting against everywhere else, that women need men in order to represent them, and that's just not the case. In 1908, the Supreme Court rules that women should or can work less than men. Essentially, that women were not as, I think the argument is that women are more dependent than men, and therefore women should not be working as many hours. It's ironic because in 1905, Lochner versus New York stated that any law that put limits on work hours was unconstitutional because the freedom to work was being violated. So here you have an argument with Lochner versus New York that's supporting men being able to work as many hours as they want, and then you've got Mueller versus Oregon, which is saying, well, women can't do the same amount of work that a man can. So we're seeing this kind of twofold argument that's going to maintain or stay around for quite a while. But again, hopefully you're seeing that the Supreme Court has this kind of double standard, that men are free to work as much as they want, that you can't restrict them. But women, yes, we can restrict them. Women are not as strong as men, and therefore cannot work as many hours. So how does that play out in political situation? Well, if you're drawing a parallel, or if you're drawing two different standards for work, surely you're going to be drawing two different standards for political participation, right? So women can't vote because they're not the same as men. And that was the fear of what many of the women's suffrage movements were looking at. So Theodore Roosevelt comes to the presidency in 1901 after William McKinley is assassinated. His domestic program can be summed up by the 3 C's: regulation of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. One of the first things he does in response to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, is pass the Pure Food and Drug Act as a way to regulate corporations, but also to protect consumers. And this was specifically focused on the Union stockyards and the ability of companies to prepare meat and make it more standardized and more sterilized. He creates the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce within the federal government, which, of course, are two ways in which to regulate corporations, but also, again, to protect the consumer. And he also creates the National Park System, which was certainly part of his conservation movement. So we have William Howard Taft coming in after Roosevelt. Roosevelt only serves the remainder of his term, I believe. Anyway, under Taft, you have the busting up of the Standard Oil Trust by the Supreme Court in 1911. You have the passage of the 16th Amendment, which brought about the income tax. And Taft is seen largely as kind of a Roosevelt follower. Where he breaks with the party, though, is that he begins to sell off reserves of natural forests to corporations. And this is seen as a violation of the conservation work that Roosevelt had been so supportive of. And that brings us to the election of 1912. And so Taft is seen as really less likely to get elected. Wilson is a very popular figure. And of course, Roosevelt, being a former president, but he's running under the Progressive Party, is seen as a front runner. So Taft is just kind of lost in the mix. And of course, it's Wilson who ends up winning. He gets 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88. And then Taft is way back there with just 8. So you have this connection between progressivism and two of the political figures, Wilson and Roosevelt. So what is new nationalism as compared to new freedom? Remember, Roosevelt is very much about the 3 C's, regulating corporations, consumer protection, and conservation. So he's favoring a much more active government role in the economic and social affairs. You have good trust versus bad trust. A good trust would be one that benefits the economy, maybe one that's an accidental trust, as opposed to Standard Oil, which would be a bad trust. He does support the direct election of senators. He supports tariff reduction. Now, what tariff reduction does is it increases America's competition with foreign-made items, because essentially what you're doing is you're lowering the cost of those imported goods in comparison to home goods that are made within the United States. He supports presidential primaries. Again, primaries are a progressive element and really a populist element as well. Regulation of monopolies, ending child labor. He pushes for the initiative and referendum, and he's pushing for women's suffrage. So Roosevelt has a good blending of progressive and populist ideas. Wilson, on the other hand, favors an active role in economic and social affairs. He favors small businesses and free functioning and unregulated and unmonopolized markets. So yes, he supports the regulation of monopolies, but not as tightly as Roosevelt would. Tackle the triple wall of privilege, the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. These are ways for corporations to maintain control of the economy. And in many ways, it's creating the monopolies, and it's encouraging government to get involved. So if you get rid of these, if you lower the tariffs, if you lower the impact of the banks and the trusts um, on government, then you have this potential to really bring about significant change. Wilson does support the issue of states' rights, which means that the federal government, most people argue with states' rights that the state is the primary focal point of power, that the state should be able to say to the federal government, hold up, you need to take a step back. This is an argument that goes back to the very beginning of the Constitution. And there really is no right or wrong. But it's an important element because one of the things about Wilson is that he is a Southerner. He's from Virginia. And this becomes an issue because Wilson, I don't want to call him a racist, but he is, many historians do call him a racist. He introduces segregation within the federal government for the first time, which is seen as an unpopular move within the federal government, but it's one that goes unchallenged. So states' rights has an air about it of being a little bit on the segregationist side. So Wilson's background, he's very intelligent. He's the president of Princeton University. He's well educated. So here we have effective freedom. John Dewey's idea that the leader of the government should be a well-educated person. You have the institution of some of Wilson's plan. The Underwood Tariff reduced duties on imports and made up the lost revenue by taxing or having a graduated income tax of 5% on the wealthiest Americans. The Clayton Act of 1914 exempted labor unions from antitrust legislation and barred courts from curbing workers' rights to strike. So here we have a nod to unions and to organized labor. What's interesting about all of this is that what he's doing is he's trying to encourage competition. The Federal Reserve System is developed during his time, Jekyll Island, Georgia. And he has the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, which is to investigate and prohibit unfair business activities such as price fixing and monopolistic practices. In other words, the development of monopolies. So really what he's doing is he's exemplifying a lot of the progressive elements. Keep in mind, this isn't about moving the government more towards a democratic system where there's more voter involvement, because progressives really don't believe in 100% democracy. In many cases, they're arguing for the removal of political corruption, and elections are not always the best way to do that. So the last slide, of course, is the coming of women's suffrage, and that will take place in 1920. But really, the West is who is showing the rest of the country how to do it. And again, we'll have women who are working towards the vote, as well as women working against the vote, which is kind of unusual.